Hi everyone, you're tuning in to week 2 of ALEC 341, our podcasting class. And here is what we are doing in week 2. We will have a guest speaker during our class time. This will be the second Wednesday face-to-face class meeting for this semester. And it's very important that you be there because it will set the tone for pretty much the rest of the semester. We will be working with Dr. Jennifer Clark, and she will be attending that class to discuss our podcasts with us. She's sort of the client for our podcasts this semester. So make sure you're at class that Wednesday. Also, you need to read the introduction and chapter 1 of our podcasting textbook. And then due by January 23rd at midnight, you should have your introductory audio turned in that we will talk about in week 1 class time, or that we did talk about in the week 1 face-to-face class. Your reflection journal number 1 and your online activity number 1, all of those are due January 23rd at midnight. So make sure you stay on top of those deadlines. Like I mentioned, we will have a guest speaker in class, so do your homework. Look her up, find out who she is, find out what she does. She is the director, Dr. Jennifer Clark is the director of the Quantitative Life Sciences Initiative here at UNL. So make sure you do some research ahead of our second class meeting to find out who she is, what the QLSI is, and the types of researchers involved. And then come with questions about her, about this initiative, about ideas for our podcasts, and also just be willing to listen, observe, and interact with her and be very engaged in that class time. So the other thing we will do with these lecture videos is I will very quickly tell you what you should be hopefully focusing on and learning from the readings each week, because we won't always have time during our face-to-face meetings to do that. So you are supposed to read the introduction in chapter 1 this week from our Turn Up the Volume, a Down and Dirty Guide to Podcasting textbook. It's written by a guy named Michael O'Connell, as you see here in this picture. He is the founder, developer, producer, all of that stuff for the It's All Journalism podcast. You can then get a little bit of background about who he is and why he is someone we should believe and trust and listen to when it comes to podcast development, design, and implementation. Also, it never hurts to look him up, read more about him, listen to a couple of the It's All Journalism podcasts to start sort of getting an understanding of where he's coming from. So something I want you to pick up from from the introduction is the statistics that they give you. They tell us that in 2008, 9% of the U.S. population was listening to podcasts, or of the people surveyed by Edison, was listening to podcasts, which grew to 13.0 something percent by 2016. And that still doesn't sound very big. Those numbers sound pretty small. That's still not like a huge listenership. But when you think about it in terms of people, that's 35 million people listening to podcasts. So that's still a pretty big audience and following of people interested in consuming media through podcasts. 75% of those listeners are listening through mobile devices. So they're not sitting at a computer and listening to it per se, or getting it through the radio. They're using their iPad, used to be iPods and smartphones, with their headphones, walking around listening to podcasts at all times, all environments of the day. On average, there are 141 downloads per podcast 30 days after it's published. So let's say we put out our Streaming Science podcast for the month, and within that month, it might be downloaded 141 times on average. That's pretty good. That's a pretty big listenership for one episode of a podcast. I would like to show you really quickly this slideshow. I had it ready about the podcast consumer. This is from the Edison Research Group that they reference in our book. And I found this on LinkedIn. It's from 2015, so a couple years old, but not bad. The Edison Research Group surveyed 2002 random Americans through phone calls that were 12 years and older to give us more of an idea of who is listening to podcasts. So this shows you those statistics, right? In 2006, about 22% said they were listening to podcasts, with a jump up to 49% in 2015. And then, that's awareness of the term podcasting. I had that incorrect. So we now have 49% of the population that's aware of what the term podcasting means. And then we've grown to 33% of the people surveyed actually listening to podcasts, which is still, like we said, about 35 million Americans. That's a pretty big percentage. So from 2010 to 2015, about 17%, which was a 5% growth, of people said, yeah, I've listened to a podcast in the last month. This shows us, we always need to be aware of who our target audience is in communication work. And so we always want to know what types of people, what ages, what demographics are consuming the media in the format that we're considering delivering our content in. This shows exactly pretty much about the same. Men and women are both equally listening to podcasts. If you look over here on the right pie chart, it'll show you that about from age 15 to 44 takes up half the chart there, right? So from age 15 to 44, those are the ages of people listening to podcasts. Usually they're older Americans listening to podcasts. And a lot of them, if you look on the right-hand side, about 14% of the listeners make $150,000 or more in their income each year. So these are pretty affluent Americans that listen to podcasts. They're older, they're educated, they make a decent salary. And so this also shows you that a lot of them have 3 years of college or a 4-year college degree or some grad school. So 31% of the surveyed listeners said that they have some grad school or higher, compared to 20% of the U.S. population. So that shows us that our podcast listeners are pretty affluent people. Also, 10% of them surveyed said they had listened to a podcast in the past month. And then this shows us that a lot of them in the past week had listened to 2 or more podcasts. So they're listening to about 6 podcasts on average every week. So why did I show you that stuff? Because it's important that you're aware of it so that you get an idea of who our target audiences are. So for streaming science, for our podcasts, we're looking at older Americans, affluent, with some college education. So just keep that in mind when we're developing our interview questions and what our podcast discussions are going to be about, that we're talking to probably a fairly educated and affluent listener. All right, also in the introduction, getting back to the reading, it describes the podcast Serial as being one of the podcasts that really became popular and was adopted quickly, one of the very first beginning ones. This was a woman doing a podcast where she would dig through serial crimes and all the details and discuss them. And people really dug it. People really got into sort of the crime podcast. This was also the podcast that sort of made waves for being one of the first ones that people really used their mobile devices to listen to. So look it up, find out more about it, maybe listen to a couple of them. The book also says that podcasts like Serial or any podcast, the reason why they can be somewhat different than radio has to appeal to a lot of different people who might be tuning in at that time. Whereas a podcast can be more granular and more specific in the audience that it talks to, because there are people that are coming to your site for your podcast and deliberately downloading it to their device to listen to on their own terms and on their own schedule. So they are a specific audience that has a specific interest in your topic. So it can be more of a granular audience, the book says. Also from the introduction, be aware of this timeline about sort of the history of podcasting. It's not that historical really quite yet. Began around 2000 with audio to RSS feeds. Then it picked up with listener subscriptions, and then iPods were popular in the early 2000s, and the Libsyn Hosting Company was one of the first companies to actually start hosting the podcasts. And then it was about, some of the first podcasts were about software and development and how to create podcasts. And then in 2005, things really started to explode with the release of iTunes. Okay, so quickly getting to chapter 1, it talks about the tenets of good podcasting. So what makes a good podcast? How do you get a good one started? You really need to have a passion for your topic. You need to really be motivated and caring and engaged and have a lot of knowledge about your topic, that you are excited to tell the world about it. So not a boring, monotone, I don't care about this topic sort of hosting style or content. You need to be really excited and geared up about it. Your podcast needs to be unique. So going back to that idea of a granular audience, there are tons of podcasts out there right now. You need to make sure yours is interesting and unique and gets people's attention so that you can get listeners, so that you can compete with all the other ones that are out there. You need to be very committed and dedicated to being a podcaster. If you are going to do one, you can't just release an episode whenever you feel like it, whenever something comes to mind. You need to already have about 2 years of ideas and content in your brain that you can start mapping out, so that you have a regular schedule and rotation of content. Also, it talks about being frequent and being consistent with those episodes, offering a promise to your audience that they can count on you, that you will always be there consistently on a regular schedule. Another good tip was start short and earn longer. Some podcasts are an hour long, an hour and a half long, 30 minutes long. There's no real guideline right now for the length of what a podcast should be, because people can download it and listen to it in spurts and starts or all at once. They can control how and when they listen to it. So the advice was start short at about 15 to 30 minutes and earn longer if your audience really loves it. Be conversational in how you deliver a podcast. You really want people to feel like they're eavesdropping on a conversation, that it's not a, hosted newscast at them with your official voice. It's really you being you, or whoever the host is being themselves, and getting to know the content experts in a real informal sort of conversation in a way that we wouldn't typically hear from those voices. Hook your audience. It says you have to be entertaining. You cannot be boring in your delivery or boring in your content. It has to be something engaging and motivating for people to listen to. And that can be in the style of the hosting. That can be in the style of the conversation and the people that you have as guests. There are a lot of ways to make it entertaining. Not necessarily with music and bells and whistles, but with good content, good hosting. Also, make sure you have good audio. A podcast uses one of our senses, hearing. That's it. We can't see anything. We're not reading anything. We're not necessarily looking at anything at the same time, or touching or feeling or tasting. We're only listening. So you have to have a strong host and a strong format for your podcast to keep people coming back. The other tenets of good podcasting: make sure you know who your listener is. Identify your target listener. We talked about some of the demographics of podcast listeners earlier. Let's narrow those down and define those for streaming science. Who are our ideal listeners? Our podcasts should always have a specific and straightforward title. Don't try and cheese it up with a cheesy title that people have no idea what it's actually truly about. Make sure the podcast title is very straightforward. Imagine an avatar is what they say in a different book that I read sometimes. And that avatar is about who is our listener. Write a narrative about who our listener is. Is it a stay-at-home mom who listens to it while she's doing dishes? Is it a science teacher who listens to it in the car when they're driving to the school in the morning? Write a narrative and describe who you think our ideal listener is. and have a conversation with the audience is also a sign of good podcasting. You not only have the interview and the conversation with the people, but you also have the audience feel like they're part of that conversation. You invite them to think about things they're hearing in the podcast. You invite them to give you feedback online, all of those good things, but make sure you are making them feel like they're part of it. Okay, so those are some of the tips from the introduction in chapter 1. You'll be working through some of the target audience stuff in class and in our online activities. This is what we have this week. We have Dr. Jennifer Clark speaking with us in class. Make sure you're there. Read the introduction in chapter 1, and then you have these things due by the 23rd at midnight. All right, everybody, make it a great week 2.